Now, the Union Army at Mindenhall, would have, Colonel Mindenhall, Major Mindenhall would have, you'd have 12-pounder Napoleons. The 12-pounder Napoleon is a tube, weighs about 1,200 pounds. It's bronze or composition, very deadly effective with canister. It had been designed by the French Army when France was under Louis Napoleon, hence the name Napoleon. It's not named for Napoleon the Great. It is probably the most popular smoothbore piece in the Civil War.
The best guns for field service are, in my opinion, the 12-pounder Napoleons, the 10-pounder Parrots, and the approved 3-inch rifles. The contest between our 6-pounder smoothbores and the 12-pounder Napoleons of the enemy is very unequal, and in addition is discouraging to our artillerists. Robert E. Lee, December 5, 1862.
It's a little heavy, has a range of about 1,700 yards with explosive shell, solid shot, or shrapnel. But where they want to use it is at 600 yards in with canister.
Fire my battery! Fire!
In an attack, artillery was used to weaken the defenses, raining upon them solid shot and explosive shell, the goal being to inflict casualties and destroy the cohesive unit of the defensive force. In order to ensure accuracy, this was most effectively achieved at relatively short range.
Battle of Bull Run, the Union by 1 o'clock looked like they're winning a battle. They've won the battle. General McDowell will order 2 batteries forward to take position on Henry Hill. These are regular batteries, the elite of the United States Army, because anybody could be an infantryman, but it took a long time to make an artillerist. They will move up onto Henry Hill, about 400 yards to their front. On the reverse slope of a ridge are 13 Confederate guns, supported by 5 Virginia regiments, commanded by Thomas Jonathan Jackson. There is an artillery duel at very close range between the guns. The Union decide to have Captain Charles Griffin move his 2 12-pounder howitzers from his left, pass them in back of his 4 12-pounder guns, pass them in back of Ricketts' rifled guns, and take position on the extreme Union right, where they can enfilade the Confederate position. Captain Griffin goes with us to his section. He has been told by Major Berry, the Chief of Artillery, that he will be supported by infantry. Griffin is putting his guns into position where they can enfilade the Confederate line. all of a sudden, coming out of the woods, 60 yards from him, crossing a worm fence, he sees men. These men are wearing kind of a bluish-gray uniform. At first Bull Run, you had no uniformity of uniforms. There will be Union units in blue, Confederate units in blue, Confederate units in gray, Confederate units in blue. So there'll be a debate who these are as the Confederates are forming. Colonel Cummings is taking position in front of his men. Griffin will say, I want to wheel the guns 90 degrees to the right and fire on them. Berry will say, no, they're our friends, they're our support. They'll be debating. Griffin holding that they're enemy and he should fire on them. Major Berry saying, no, they're friends. By this time, the Confederates have closed to within 30 or 40 yards. Only then does Berry realize what they are. But it's too late. The Confederates open a crashing volley at point-blank range. Some of the men go down. Even more critical, all the team are shot down. And the Confederates will surge forward and capture the guns.
The most effective use of artillery, then, was in a defensive capacity. A massed battery of guns could hold up an enemy advance, and if the invading force was crossing a wide open field, the effects of a massed battery attack could be devastating.
Artillery.
A gun, double loaded with canister, could be discharged directly into the faces of the attacking forces as they reached the muzzles.
The Rockbridge Artillery was raised in Lexington, Virginia. Its initial commander was William Nelson Pendleton. William Nelson Pendleton will eventually be General Lee's chief of artillery, but he had been the rector in the Episcopal Church in Lexington. He raised this battery, and it was armed with 6-pounder guns, too light a gun for the Civil War, good for the Mexican War. And the guns were named, being a good Episcopalian, he named them Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, since they were interesting guns, but not very effective, they will be phased out. And Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are still down at VMI. Supposedly at First Manassas, as we're Confederates now, as we're being William Nelson Pendleton, he is supposed to have said when he opens fire, oh, fire, and God have mercy on their souls.
First, there were guns, heavy, long-barreled weapons used to batter fortifications at long range. Guns were classified by the weight of the solid projectiles they fired. Howitzers were short-barreled guns capable of high-angle fire to drop explosive shells behind obstacles, such as a hill, which a flat trajectory weapon could not reach. Mortars were used for firing shells at great elevations into the enemy's fortifications. It was the weight of the projectile, not its velocity, that produced the mortar's destructive effect. The 13-inch mortar fired a 200-pound shell, and in spite of a high trajectory, a mortar could range well over a mile. Finally, the Columbiad guns combined the features of the gun, the howitzer, and the mortar, and were the heaviest pieces in use during the war.
The 12-pounder howitzer. It has a short barrel, where the Napoleon has a long barrel. The 12-pounder howitzer is lighter, but has a far shorter range than the Napoleon. The 24-pounder howitzer is simply a large 12-pounder howitzer. It's both longer and heavier. The difference being the heavier projectile fired by the 24-pounder howitzer. It's less popular because the tube is heavier, which makes it more difficult to maneuver.
The 12-pounder and 24-pounder howitzer saw much service in the early days of the war. General Robert E. Lee had 26 12-pounder howitzers at the Battle of Gettysburg, but they were soon phased out by both the North and South due to their short range and because of the apparent difficulty of the gunner to observe their fire with any degree of accuracy.
They'll also have 10-pounder Parrotts, a gun developed by Robert P. Parrott and cast at his Cold Springs, New York foundry across from West Point. It has about a 2,800-yard range, the 10-pounder Parrott, but it does not handle canister well.
The Confederates attempted to duplicate the 10 and 12-pound Parrotts, but met with limited success, choosing instead to rely on captured Union Parrotts.
Now, large Parrotts, 100-pound, 200-pound, and 300-pound Parrott, you did not want to, you had to be very worried about being with them, manning them. They used them, of course, in sieges, and the Navy wouldn't use them on a ship after a few experiments because they burst so many times. One of these would be the famed Swamp Angel, which the Union had put a great deal of effort on, positioning on James Island to bombard that citadel of the Confederacy, Charleston. But after all that work, it fires 23 rounds and bursts.
In the Army, the captain was the commander of the battery. Lieutenants were appointed to command gun sections, left, right, and center. A sergeant was often the gunner. Aside from the gunner, the gun crew was comprised of 7 artillerymen, each with a separate job for servicing the gun in battle. At full strength, a battery, cannoneers, sergeants, buglers, officers, and horsemen, exceeded 100 men. A 2-wheeled vehicle called a limber transported the cannon, and in the Union Army, each limber was drawn by a 6-horse team.
Also, the Union who had the capabilities, as the war progresses, particularly in the East, will reduce their batteries from 6-gun to 4-gun and up the ratio of smoothbores. Because the Confederates, realizing the Union guns are more and generally better technologically, are wanting to fight in the woods. In the wooded areas of eastern Virginia, long-range guns are not a great advantage. A smoothbore gun firing canister is. They also have the 3-inch Rodman rifle. The Rodman rifle is lighter than the Parrott, tube weighing about 800 pounds.
After the Napoleon, the 3-inch guns were considered the most reliable, both in service and in numbers. The piece was so well liked that the 10-pounder Parrotts were converted to use the same ammunition. At the Battle of Gettysburg, 146 of General Meade's 360 guns were 3-inch ordnance guns.
Now, when the war broke out, the Confederates would lack any capability to manufacture artillery on a large scale. The initial Confederate batteries, when the war broke out, would be issued ordnance that had been stored in the arsenals in the South, or had belonged to various militia units. Initially in the war, particularly in the East, the best provider of armament for the Confederates is the Union Army. At First Manassas, the Confederates capture almost 30 guns. At Second Manassas, 44 guns. And the Confederates will start an arms industry of their own. Tredegar will become a key manufacturer of Confederate ordnance.
The Tredegar Foundry of Richmond, Virginia, was one of the largest manufacturers of cannon in the nation. But Tredegar could not alone fill the needs of the southern states.
And then they will have many small foundries in the South. We'll be manufacturing cannon on a very limited basis.
The 12-pounder Whitworth breech-loading rifle was developed in Great Britain by Sir Joseph Whitworth.
One muzzle-loading 6-pounder and 6 breech-loading 12-pounder Whitworths were distributed through the Army and often rendered valuable service by their great range and accuracy. They fired solid shot almost exclusively, but they were perfectly reliable, and their projectiles never failed to fly in the most beautiful trajectory imaginable. Their breech-loading arrangements, however, often worked with difficulty, and every one of the 6 was at some time disabled by the breaking of some of its parts, but all were repaired again and kept in service. As a general field piece, its efficiency was impaired by its weight and the very cumbrous English carriage on which it was mounted. And while a few with an army may often be valuable, the United States 3-inch rifle is much more generally serviceable with good ammunition. General E.P. Alexander, CSA, Chief of Artillery, James Longstreet Corps, 1866.
Much to the consternation of Union intelligence officers, whose job it was to gather intelligence on enemy strength and firepower, the Confederacy often used what were called Quaker guns, logs mounted to deceive Union forces into believing they were about to confront heavy artillery.
Another time that artillery is decisive is at Stones River on the 2nd day of January, 1863. A Union force has crossed Stones River at McFadden's Ford and takes position east of the river. From there, their guns could enfilade General Bragg's line west of the river. Bragg decides to attack this Union force, which is supported east of the river by one battery. Bragg will mass 4,100 men under General Breckinridge, whose mission is to attack this Union force east of the river. The Confederates will advance, and the Union brigades will collapse. Flee toward Stones River and McFadden's Ford with the victorious Confederates letting go the rebel yell, pursuing them. Just as it looks like victory is at hand, the Union's left wing's chief of artillery, Major Mendenhall, will begin massing guns Altogether, you'll soon have 57 guns. They'll open fire. Gaps will appear in the Confederate ranks. General Hanson will go down. And within a few moments, the Confederates, when it seemed like victory was in their grasp, are falling back pursued by the Union, leaving behind 1,600 of their comrades.